Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, a new era begins as Donald Trump becomes the 47th U.S. president, and celebrations across Israel as 3 freed hostages rejoin their families and begin their re-entry. And what are the implications for Israel and the Middle East? Plus, looking to Iran and the possibility of a nuclear strike, or Iran attacking its neighbors. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully...
With those words, Donald J. Trump became the 47th President of the United States. Trump's return to the White House marks a profound shift in American domestic and international policies. The so-called Trump effect began even before his swearing in, especially here in the Middle East. Before his inauguration, he declared there would be hell to pay if hostages held by Hamas inside Gaza were not released. The releasing of the hostages did begin earlier this week after the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas kicked into effect Sunday morning. 3 Israeli women returned to the embrace of their family and friends. And CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has the story, which will follow with an excerpt of a conversation with CBN President Gordon Robertson.
Joy and tears surrounded the 3 women, Emily Damari, Doron Steinbrecher, and Romy Gonen, as they returned to Israel and the embrace of family and friends. As the 3 arrived at the Sheba Medical Center outside Tel Aviv, the crowd went wild. Friends were beside themselves with joy.
Our hearts are bursting, exploding. She looks just like she did when she left, as special and beautiful as she is.
Inside, the medical professionals took over.
I'm happy to report that they are in stable condition that allows us and them to focus on what is the most important thing for now, is reuniting with their families.
The Israeli military's chief spokesman weighed in after the women's release.
We cannot imagine the horrors these 3 young women have endured in 50 months of Hamas captivity.
Until the last moment in Gaza, the 3 hostages were terrorized, with Hamas gunmen and a mob of Gazan civilians surrounding their convoy and screaming at them. Hamas gave them gift bags with certificates of release, a map of Gaza, and photos of their time in captivity. Then the women were handed over to the Red Cross, which transported them into the hands of Israeli forces. As soon as the ceasefire took place, scores of armed Hamas fighters appeared from their hiding places and quickly took control again in the streets of Gaza. They're declaring they've won a mighty victory over Israel. This image of a conquering Hamas terrorist with his foot on the back of kneeling Benjamin Netanyahu is making the rounds in Arab media. The head of Hamas's military wing put out a video calling for Palestinians in the so-called West Bank to escalate their attacks on Israel. Hagari says the IDF is ready to face any threat.
In
this agreement, there are risks and there are challenges. We know how to come back and fight and stand up for all the goals of the war.
Shortly after Hamas freed the 3 women hostages, Israel began releasing 90 Palestinian prisoners, the first of more than 1,000 to be released, some of them terrorists who murdered Jews in well-known attacks, one of the most frightening aspects for Israelis. As the deal goes forward, Hamas is supposed to release 30 more prisoners in the coming weeks in exchange for hundreds more terrorists. Negotiations are supposed to continue until all hostages are released and a permanent ceasefire is in place. With the Trump administration taking over today, Senator Lindsey Graham insists Hamas' declaration of victory will be short-lived.
This war will never end with Hamas in charge of Gaza, politically or militarily. Their days are numbered.
Graham also suggests that the new administration gives support to Israel in dealing with an even larger threat, an Iran that could soon be armed with nuclear bombs.
I am hoping there will be an effort by Israel to decimate the Iran nuclear program supported by the United States, and if we don't do that, it will be a historical mistake.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell joins us now. And Chris, I've just got to observe, it looked like Hamas was well funded. I mean, those were brand new uniforms. They had plenty of weapons. Nobody looked like they were starving. What about all these reports of just the horror in Gaza? It just didn't seem to be reflected in that visual.
Yeah, for the last 15 months, a lot of people have been saying there's a genocide, and now they're declaring victory. And some people are saying, well, which is it? Is it genocide or victory? And obviously, they're getting some funding. And part of that funding, people are saying, Gordon, comes from the humanitarian aid that has been coming in, that actually Hamas steals perhaps up to 40% or more of that humanitarian aid to fund what they're doing. And now they're above ground, no longer in the tunnels and no longer without uniforms. Now they're with uniforms, and they typically do that only when there's a ceasefire. But I would say, Gordon, coming back, and I've been in the States for a few weeks, coming back here to Israel and just sensing the mood here and the atmosphere. So many Israelis are really reeling. They're conflicted about what's going on. The hostages for 15 months have been an open wound on Israeli society. Israel's a big family. They're euphoric about the release of Doron, Romy, and Emily. Tears, celebrations. And yet, on the other hand, there's a real concern that the released prisoners, there's been 90 so far, and they're planning to be up to 1,700. So there's a big discussion in Israel right now about the deal. Earlier, I talked to a rabbi and explained to me that everyone in Jewish life is pro-life. Life is their highest value. Everyone's jubilant for Doron, Emily, and Romy. But when is the price of one hostage more than you should pay? When does it cost even more lives? And when does it incentivize your enemy to kidnap more? And that's the anguish that Israelis are facing right now and have faced for 15 months. It's excruciating. And Gordon, it's not theoretical. It's been chronicled. In 2011, more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released for just one IDF soldiers. And those terrorists, they killed over 190 Israelis, including Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, who eventually masterminded October 7th. Israelis are still taking in with delight any bits of news about the 3 women freed by Hamas on Sunday. And President Trump is assuring hostage families the U.S. and Israel will continue doing all they can to make sure the rest come home. Paul Strand has more from Jerusalem.
Israel continues to rejoice at the freedom of 3 of its daughters. The Army has released video of when the 3 first saw their mothers and FaceTimed their families. That was just a short while after their 15 months of captivity in Gaza ended. A friend of freed hostage Emily Damari described their first moments together.
We hugged her, we cried, we were moved, we shouted and screamed. Seeing her standing like this was the most exciting thing in the world, and fun.
Damari's mother praised her daughter.
I'm delighted to be able to tell you that Emily is in high spirits on the road to recovery. As you will have seen last night, she is an amazingly strong and resilient young woman.
In Tel Aviv, Israelis stopped by Hostages Square to rejoice for those freed, but also remember those still held captive.
And to think of each one as if it were my boy, my girl, my mother, my father. We will not rest and will not be silent until everyone returns.
Everybody needs to remember that, yes, our 3 beautiful girls came home yesterday, but we have 94 more that need to come home, and we won't stop until they all do.
In Gaza, Hamas may have been bombarded and hunted down for 15 months by Israeli forces, but as the ceasefire took hold, Hamas police and fighters quickly emerged and took back control of the streets. As for the citizens of Gaza, many are returning to their homes to find nothing but rubble.
I came to our house to check on it. I found the house completely destroyed and unfit for living. We have no other place to go, so I will have to set up a tent on top of the rubble of my house and live in it.
In Washington, after his inauguration, President Trump greeted former hostages and family members of those still in captivity.
So now the work begins. We won, but now the work begins. We have to bring them home.
Trump is expressing pessimism about Hamas and Israel getting through all 3 stages of the ceasefire without renewed fighting. But he's optimistic Saudi Arabia might well join the Abraham Accords and forge an historic peace with the Jewish nation. Israel's prime minister sent Trump his congratulations and hopes for what America and Israel can accomplish together.
I'm confident that we will complete the defeat of Iran's terror axis and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity for our region. I look forward to working with you to return the remaining hostages, to destroy Hamas's military capabilities and end its political rule in Gaza, and to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, mixed emotions in Israel. Analysis on the hostage deal from Alex Trayman of JNS News. With phase one of the ceasefire hostage deal underway and 3 young women released from 15 months of terror in Gaza, Israelis are experiencing mixed reactions. Chief among them, relief and apprehension. Hamas may be decimated, but it's not destroyed. Alex Trayman from the Jewish News Syndicate shared his thoughts about this complicated moment. Alex Trayman, thanks for joining us. Tell us what your reaction is to the hostage deal that just brought 3 young Israeli women back home.
Well, a lot of emotions here in Israel over the last 24 hours. Certainly elation to see, even just 3 of our hostages returned in relative peace and good health. Of course, we're waiting to see whether Hamas will deliver the other of the 33 hostages that it's supposed to return in this phase of the deal, of which Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that most are alive. So we don't know what most means. Is that 51% of the hostages? Is that 90% of the 33? So we're waiting to see what most means. I think you're going to see over the next 6 weeks period in which these hostages are dripped out and returned to Israel, the potential for a lot of emotional and psychological torture from Hamas. And of course, a lot of anger that Israel is being forced to release over 1,700 prisoners, some of whom were prisoners of war taken in Gaza during this period, and another 700 that are serving in Israeli jails for acts of terror that they committed against Israelis even prior to October 7th, many of them with blood on their hands, many of them committing mass murder incidents.
You wrote an excellent article about the hostage deal on jnsnews.org. I recommend it to everyone listening. What are some of the other concerns that people have about this deal that may end possibly, the IDF war against Hamas in Gaza?
Well, I think that's a big question, whether this is a temporary ceasefire, if in fact this is the end of the war with Hamas, or whether phase 1 will lead to a phase 2 and a phase 3 of this agreement with the release of all of the hostages and an end to the conflict. Also, major strategic questions about whether Hamas survives this war and will still be in charge of the Gaza Strip, or if some other force, including potentially the IDF, will emerge and set up a provincial military government inside Gaza, and whether this is only one front of the war, and if the other fronts will continue, including in Lebanon. We know a ceasefire agreement there is set to expire in a few days.
Some people think that the incoming administration may be the most pro-Israel in actually history. You have Pete Hegseth, you have Mike Waltz, you have Marco Rubio and Governor Mike Huckabee as the potential U.S. ambassador. On the other hand, you mentioned this in your article about a Middle East envoy that really is well connected with Qatar. What's your concerns about that?
Well, certainly. I mean, Witkoff came in, and I think that the feeling was that with the Trump administration about to enter office, that Israel was going to have a freer hand to conduct the war as it wanted to. And instead of seeing only pressure being placed on Hamas, it is clear that Witkoff came to put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu to reach this deal before the inauguration, when by all accounts, Netanyahu's negotiating position and his leverage would have increased dramatically had they only waited another week. So I think that there's a lot of people in Israeli political circles here that are questioning whether Witkoff is as pro-Israel as some of the other members of the administration that you mentioned. People certainly questioning the close ties that he has to the Qataris, who bought a hotel off of him in New York City recently for over $600 million. His son also doing business in Qatar, and then Witkoff saying that the Qatari leadership was doing God's work in trying to negotiate this hostage deal, when we know that Qatar has been the one that have been housing Hamas leaders, including Ismail Haniyeh and Khalid Mashal, for years, and has funneled over the last several years billions of dollars into the Gaza Strip.
One question a lot of people I know people are asking, Alex, there must be something else to this deal that we're not hearing about in the public. For example, maybe the U.S. is pledging they're going to help Israel attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Is this what you're hearing as well?
Well, certainly, when you talk about the pressure that Witkoff put on Netanyahu, certainly there were sticks involved, but one also has to believe that there were many carrots that were put in front of Netanyahu, and that refers to the release of weapons that Israel desperately needs to not just continue this war, but to rebuild its arsenal so that it is not completely vulnerable if another war or another front breaks out. Whether there's been conversations with Israel about an attack on the Houthis in Yemen, certainly about the attack of Iranian nuclear facilities and potential overthrow of the Iranian regime, and then also the removal of sanctions placed by the Biden administration on the so-called settlers, Jews living in Judea and Samaria. That was a sort of extrajudicial sanctions regime put on Israelis that seemed to be completely out of line with due process and what Israel would have expected from an ally. So there's a lot that the Trump administration could have promised Israel.
Alex Strayman from jns.org. I recommend everyone check out your website. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Up next, the swiftly changing dynamic, the Middle East crisis in play as Donald Trump begins his presidency. In addition to many domestic challenges, some of the other major issues the new Trump administration will face are the crises in the Middle East. CBN's Middle East correspondent Paul Strand looks at how America might help turn these problems into positive possibilities.
With the ceasefires in Lebanon and Gaza, the weakening of the Islamic regime in Iran, and the fall of the Assad dictatorship in Syria, Trump's choice for Secretary of State sees chances for real change.
There are now factors at play in the Middle East that I think we can build upon and may open the door to extraordinary and historic opportunities.
Though wounded, Iran is still dangerous as it moves closer to becoming a nuclear power. It's rapidly enriching uranium to a degree it could be used in a dozen nuclear bombs. It's also working on ballistic missiles that could deliver those nukes to anywhere on planet Earth. Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged he'll never let the Islamic regime get that far, but it might take U.S. assistance and the kind of massive bunker-buster bombs only America possesses to knock out Iran's underground nuclear facilities. In Gaza, Hamas seems far from dead, and it's working to rebuild its forces and keep control of the area. While the international community backs Palestinians ruling in Gaza, Rubio pointed out what happened after they took control from Israel in 2005.
Hamas won an election, they took over, and they destroyed the place and built tunnels for terrorists to operate from. So the key is not simply governance, it's who will govern. You can't turn it over to people who seek your destruction.
As Israel continues to expand settlements in Judea and Samaria, some advocate it annex the area, and recall that Trump backed Israel annexing Syria's Golan Heights for security reasons. As for Syria, the big question there is if its new Islamic leaders will become a threat to Israel, especially since in the past they've spoken openly of wanting to march on Jerusalem to retake it for Islam. There are also concerns their plan to declare Sharia law throughout the nation will make Christians and other religious minorities second-class citizens at risk of persecution. Perhaps the greatest achievement Trump could pull off would be an expansion of the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia. While that would be a game-changer for the Middle East, it faces a huge hurdle, as Saudi Arabia maintains it won't join the accords till the Palestinians are on the way to their own state, bringing what the Saudis believe will be long-term peace in the region. Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, Iran analysis. Chuck Colton on what could be the next moves by Israel and Iran. "2024 and the beginning of 2025 have seen monumental changes in the Middle East. From the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, the demise of Hezbollah and Hamas, Iran's two main proxies in the region, and the rise of Turkey as an emerging powerhouse, the makeup of the nation surrounding the Jewish state are all shifting. One of the main questions for Israel and the new Trump administration is what to do about Iran's nuclear program. Could this be the year when IDF warplanes strike what many perceive as an existential threat to Israel? I discuss this question and more with CBN News war correspondent Chuck Holton. Chuck, here we are in the beginning of 2025. As you said, the center of gravity has changed in the region. Do you foresee the possibility of an Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear facilities and the possibility of the U.S. Either giving a green light after Inauguration Day or joining in the attack?
This is where the conflict, I think, could become much more interesting. The Israelis will certainly not have the guardrails on them that the Biden administration would have put on them about striking at Iran after the Trump administration gets in. And they may actually just be waiting for that day so that they can strike at Iran's nuclear capabilities. Iran, for its part, came out in the last 24 hours and said that they have now replenished their supplies of anti-air defenses, which probably doesn't make much of a difference at all anyway, because there really aren't any anti-air defenses in the world today that could take out an F-35 or an F-22 or even an F-16 with the right package on it. So the Israelis don't have to worry about any kind of problem from Iran in terms of shooting down their aircraft if they wanted to do that. But here's where this gets more interesting. As Iran sees its position being weakened through its proxies, it becomes more and more likely, I think, that Iran will actually attack Saudi Arabia and to attack what they see as a proxy of the West. And it's much closer where they could actually use their conventional army for something, because Iran has the largest conventional army in the region, over 500,000 troops. But it's not expeditionary. That means they can only threaten countries that actually abut their country or are very close to their country. And so it would be more possible, at least. It's not possible for them to march across Iraq and Syria and Jordan to get to Israel, but it might be possible for them to march on Saudi Arabia. And so I think that the chances of them attacking Saudi Arabia actually go up in the coming days and weeks.
Wow, fascinating insight. Chuck Holton, CBN News war correspondent, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Sure thing.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And please keep praying at this critical moment in Israel's history that all the hostages could be released and for the Lord's protection for all of Israel. As it says in Isaiah chapter 46, verse 4, I have made you and I will carry you. I will sustain you and I will rescue you. I'm Chris Mitchell. For all of us here at the Jerusalem Bureau, we'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.